He has served on many national committees, including several with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and was recently awarded the Student Choice Teaching Award at the University of Utah for his pedagogy. Professor Parker is also a prominent archaeologist, and among his significant field experience, he has been for some 10 years director of the Upper Tigris Archaeological Research Project, or UTARP, for which he has conducted surveys and directed the excavations at Kenan Tepe, Turkey. He also founded the University of Utah Microarchaeology Laboratory. I told my students that's not where they excavate little houses. But, Professor Parker has organized 3 international conferences at the University of Utah, including, for those who might be interested, a plug, the upcoming conference, Household Archaeology in the Middle East and Beyond, Theory, Method, and Practice, to be held February 19th through 21st, 2009 at the U. And I believe our own Jeff Chadwick will be presenting there. I don't know if he's here. His intellectual pursuits have helped to advance analytical frameworks in the study of the ancient Near East, ancient Near Eastern history, and to promote cross-disciplinary investigation and collaboration. His first book, The Mechanics of Empire, The Northern Frontier of Assyria as a Case Study in Imperial Dynamics, was published in 2001, and he has edited 2 others, including Untaming the Frontier in Anthropology, Archaeology, and History. His topic today, Provincial Power in the Assyrian Empire, a Microhistory of a Provincial Administrator, continues his work on empire and the frontier. Join me in welcoming Professor Parker to BYU.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming. It's nice to see such a big crowd and people so enthusiastic about Near Eastern things. I think I'll go ahead and launch right into the paper, and after the paper, if we have questions, then we'll save those questions for that time. Mesopotamian studies is on the brink of a new era. Since its inception in the mid-19th century, Assyriologists, archaeologists, and historians alike have struggled with the wealth of source material pertaining to Mesopotamian civilization. Several generations of scholars have spent their lives compiling the tools that are essential to further Mesopotamian research. Now, in the early 21st century, the diligence of these scholars is finally coming to fruition. Monumental projects like the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, the Rio Lexicon de Assyriologie, the State Archives of Assyria, the Royal Inscriptions of Mesopotamia, etc., which have been decades in the making, are nearing final completion. With the sources for Mesopotamian studies now at our fingertips, the next generation of scholars, that would be you, are now able to focus on syntheses and interpretation, while cross-cultural comparisons will finally allow Mesopotamian studies to be integrated into the study of history and anthropology. The purpose of this paper is to attempt such a synthesis by viewing a small set of Neo-Assyrian data through the lens of an historical methodology. This paper is meant to serve first as a brief example of what can now be done using the Mesopotamian data, and second, to act as a corrective for work published in the prosopography of the Assyrian Empire. To do so, I will consider a small group of texts that are either attributed to, written to, or mention a particular individual, namely a provincial official calling himself a Shipa. I will analyze these texts in the light of an historical methodology known as microhistory. Simply put, microhistory is the study of small pieces of history. Instead of focusing on nation-states, ethnic groups, or famous figures, for example, microhistory typically concentrates on what are considered to be more ordinary villages, families, or individuals. Although the subjects of microhistorical research are not usually responsible for important events, historical events, or processes, they are seen as representative or illustrative of a particular time. However, the goal of microhistory is not just to illuminate events or circumstances otherwise disconnected from larger historical processes. On the contrary, the premise of microhistory is that history, even major events or long-term trends, are grounded in the actions of individuals. Instead of seeing history as a larger process that is imposed upon people from above, Microhistory sees the flow of history as propelled by the accumulated actions of individuals or groups. By utilizing microhistory as a lens through which to view a particular provincial administrator, this paper will do two things. First, it will attempt to reconstruct some aspects of this individual's life by placing him within a particular geographic and chronological framework. Second, this paper will use the resulting narrative to exemplify historical circumstances and processes prevalent at his time. In doing so, it will highlight how this history played out on the provincial level. During its heyday from about 900 to 600 BC, the Assyrian Empire was arguably the largest and most complex political formation the world had yet seen. After its initial stage of expansion during the 9th century BC, Assyria came to dominate the entire region of what we today call the Middle East, from the Zagros Mountains in modern Iran to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and from the Taurus Mountains in southern Turkey to the Persian Gulf. Through their imperial policies, the Assyrians became a driving force in shaping the political, cultural, and demographic makeup of the ancient Middle East, setting the stage upon which much of the drama of the Old Testament was played out and helping to preserve and transmit much of the tradition of Mesopotamian civilization to the Persian and Mediterranean worlds. This deep history left an indelible mark on the development of civilization both within and beyond the Middle East. During the Assyrian imperial period, Ashipa was an unusual name. According to the prosopography of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, there are as many as 4, or alternatively as few as 2, individuals mentioned in the Assyrian texts bearing this name. The relative infrequency of Ashipa is paralleled by the fact that the etymology and origin of this name are unknown. There are a total of 20 known letters and 2 known administrative documents in the Neo-Assyrian corpus that pertain directly to a person known as Ashipa. Of these, a relatively large group of 14 letters certainly belong to or refer to a single individual, although, as we shall see, it is not impossible that all but one of these texts belongs to a single person. It is this individual who will be the focus of this study. In spite of the fact that even 14 texts attributable to a single person represent a relatively large corpus, none of these documents state explicitly what position this official held. The author of Ashipa's entry in the prosopography claims, rightfully I think, that Ashipa served as a provincial administrator, quote, in the northern part of the Assyrian Empire, end quote. Although Ashipa does not appear as a provincial administrator in the Assyrian Eponym Chronicle, there are frequent references to mountainous landscape in these texts, and many of the duties performed by this official are paralleled by those of other governors of northern provinces. While this reasoning makes sense, the prosopography goes on to name Tidu as the city from which Ashipa ruled, and then places Ashipa's territory, quote, on the banks of the Euphrates, east of Amedi. This assertion is problematic because there is no evidence that the city of Tidu was ever the seat of a provincial capital. It does not appear in the Eponym Chronicle as such, nor is there any mention of a provincial administration at Tidu in the Neo-Assyrian correspondence. Furthermore, almost 30 years ago, Karl-Heinz Kessler argued that the city of Tidu was located on the Tigris River, not the Euphrates, and should be identified with the site of Uchtepe. This set of circumstances leaves us in a bit of a conundrum. If the data suggest that Ashipa was a high-ranking provincial official, perhaps even a provincial governor, yet we cannot say for certain where he served, then where does this leave us? Some insight to this problem can be gained from the content of Ashipa's letters and the toponyms they contain. On the issue of Ashipa's role in the Assyrian administration, it should first be noted that all of the letters written by Ashipa are addressed directly to the king. In addition, 2 letters are written from the Assyrian king Sargon to Ashipa, and a number of Ashipa's letters contain responses to inquiries from Sargon that are undoubtedly part of a much wider correspondence now lost to us. These data show that Ashipa was in regular and direct contact with the highest echelons of Assyrian administration, a privilege reserved only for a very few high-ranking officials. The information Ashipa's letters contain is quite varied, but in every instance, Ashipa reports on matters that are of direct relevance to the governance of an Assyrian frontier province. The topics discussed in these texts can be broken down into two broad categories: security matters and economic matters. Ashipa's involvement in the provincial security is attested by reports on the location and movements of enemy governors and soldiers, the status of reports of Assyrian spies, and the activities of Assyrian troops. Ashipa's oversight of economic production and the exploitation of provincial resources is attested by reports on the state of Assyrian storehouses, the production of wool, and the extraction of natural resources such as logs, stone, and saplings. Also critical to any interpretation of Ashipa's role is the beginning of SAA 521, where Ashipa informs the king that he has moved all of the people under his jurisdiction into, quote, fortified places, the Beit Dorani, in anticipation of a potential attack. This reference suggests that Ashipa governed a particular area and its inhabitants. Ashipa's correspondence also contains a large amount of geographic information, which together paints a relatively vivid picture of the location and environment of the region under Ashipa's control. To begin with, a reference to snow, or in this case, a lack of snow, in SAA 526, combined with several references to a river, limit the possible area of Ashipa's jurisdiction to the northern and northeastern provinces. This attribution is underscored by Ashipa's concern with events in Assyria's arch-enemy Urartu, and by the fact that Ashipa appears to be in charge of monitoring Assyria's interests in the kingdom of Shubria. In addition to this general information, there are two specific references that much more precisely locate the area under Ashipa's control. First, a letter from Nashir Bel, the governor of Amedi, to Sargon, explains that Nashir Bel purchased 400 hectares of land, formerly belonging, quote, to the subjects of Ashipa, and added it to the province of Amedi. In addition to supporting the observation that Ashipa was in control of a specific region and its inhabitants, this letter also suggests that Ashipa's territory bordered the province of Amedi. However, the most decisive geographic evidence comes from SAA 521, where Ashipa refers to the Urartian provinces of Pulua and Danibani as being, quote, opposite us. Pulua occurs again in a letter from Shah Ashur-dubu, a governor of Tushan, who states that Pulua was opposite Tushan. This reference to Tushan and the office of the governor there is but one of many parallels in content and phraseology between Ashipa's correspondence and that of Shah Ashur-dubu. Ashipa uses, as part of his greeting formula, the phrase, "The forts and the land of the king, my lord, are well." I have argued elsewhere that many of the greeting formulas used in the Assyrian royal correspondence are geographically specific. And I have even suggested that these greeting formulas might be used to infer the provenance of letters whose origin is otherwise unknown. Following this logic, it is important to note that the greeting formula utilized by Ashipa is found in letters from Tushan, and to a lesser extent, letters from Amedi. Although no single reference can be shown to provide definitive proof of the role that Ashipa played in the Assyrian administration, the data outlined above strongly suggest that Ashipa was an Assyrian provincial governor who was, at least for a time, in charge of the Assyrian province of Tushan. This conclusion is seemingly contradicted by the Assyrian eponym chronicle, which does not include Ashipa and instead lists Shah Ashur-dubu as the governor of Tushan during the reign of Sargon in 707 BC. I would suggest, therefore, that two separate governors of the province of Tushan are represented in the correspondence of Sargon. If this is the case, there is unfortunately very little information that might help to clarify the internal chronology of the letters in the Neo-Assyrian corpus, nor is there any direct evidence as to the order of the two governors. The only firm date we have is 707 BC, at which time Shah Ashur-dubu is mentioned in the Eponym Chronicle as the governor of Tushan. To tackle this problem, let us turn again to the content of the letters, but in this case, let us consider the historical rather than the geographic and administrative information they contain. There is a general consensus among scholars that the continued harassment of the Urartians by the Cimmerian tribes of the north and the decisive defeat of the Urartians during Sargon's 8th campaign in 714 BC marked the beginning of a decline in Urartu. In this context, let us consider SAA 521. This document is a letter from Ashipa to Sargon. It mentions that a messenger has come to Ashipa with a letter from the king warning him of an impending attack from Urartu. Although later letters indicate that Urartu continued to be a threat throughout the reign of Sargon, the context of this letter suggests that it dates to a period before the above-mentioned decline in Urartian power, and may even have been part of the correspondence that surely took place in the run-up to Sargon's 8th campaign in 714 BC. Furthermore, the context of SAA 531, a letter from Shah Ashur-dubu, indicates that this text dates to the reign of the Urartian king. Furthermore, the context of SAA 531, which is a different letter, a letter written by Shah Ashur-dubu, indicates that his text dates to the reign of the Urartian king, and I've never been able to pronounce this, Argisti, or is it Argishti? So you're with me, right? Who took the throne of Urartu after Rusa's failure against the Assyrians in 714. So this is the next Urartian king. These data suggest that Ashipa was governor of Tushan in the period prior to the two hard dates we have, that is Sargon's 8th campaign in 714 BC and Shah Ashur-dubu's tenure in the office of the Eponym in 707 BC. This would place Ashipa in Tushan before 714 and would suggest that Shah Ashur-dubu was governor of Tushan from sometime after 714 until sometime after 707 BC. Having examined in detail the letters in the Sargonid corpus attributed to Ashipa, and in doing so established with the greatest amount of certainty possible given the extant data, his role in the Assyrian provincial administration, we must now consider the remainder of the texts that contain or are attributed to individuals with the same name. In the prosopography of the Assyrian Empire, Karin Radner considers there to be 4 separate individuals bearing the name Ashipa in the Neo-Assyrian corpus. Let's now examine the first of these individuals, so-called PNA Ashipa I, who is known from 5 letters in the Nimrud corpus. The context of these letters suggests that Ashipa of the Nimrud corpus was a mid-ranking official who was responsible for various aspects of the Assyrian administration of Babylonia. In 3 cases, he reports on grain shipments, and in 3 texts mention boats which were probably used for transporting grain or other products from or within Babylonia. It is generally accepted that the letters in the Nimrud corpus date either to the latter part of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III or to the beginning of the reign of Sargon. Thus, it is safe to say that the Nimrud corpus and the Sargonid letters are likely separated by some 5 to 25 years. If this is the case, then it is certainly possible from a chronological point of view that the Ashipa responsible for the Nimrud letters and the Ashipa responsible for the Sargon letters are, in fact, the same person. The fact that PNA Ashipa No. 1 is a mid-ranking official who appears to be in charge of relatively mundane tasks fits well, I suggest, with this theory. Following this line of reasoning, we might envision a scenario in which a single individual named Ashipa could have been promoted from a lower-ranking administrative position in Babylonia, either at the end of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III or at the beginning of the reign of Sargon, to the post of governor of an outlying province in the first decade or so of Sargon's reign. If we assume that Ashipa would have been in his early 20s when he took his first posting with the imperial administration, then by the time he became governor early in the reign of Sargon, he might have been, let's say, between 30 and 40 years old. If he then held the governorship for, say, 10 years, or 10 years or so, this would mean that he was in his 40s when he retired and was replaced by Shah Ashur-Dubu. To summarize this part, then, I would suggest that although there is no way to be certain exactly how many individuals bearing the name Ashipa are represented in the Assyrian corpus, a good argument can be made to support the theory that there are likely two. The first is responsible for or mentioned in a total of 20 letters, including 6 from the Nimrud corpus and 14 from the Sargon corpus. The second individual is known from only a single administrative text, and I rule out the final one because of a break. The spelling is not exactly correct. So the following analysis then is based on this hypothesis. Drawing a connection between the Nimrud letters and the Sargon letters gives us an interesting perspective on the life and career of an Assyrian official. The data suggest that early in his career, Ashipa served as a mid-ranking administrator in Babylonia. In this capacity, Ashipa arranged and accounted for the transfer of substantial amounts of staples by ship. Although Assyrio-Babylonian relations have been the topic of considerable work by a number of scholars, few studies have focused on the details of how Assyrian administrators and how the Assyrian Empire administered the region during the periods that they held control there. In this light, it is tempting to see the large shipments of barley described by Ashipa as tribute or tax revenue extracted from Babylonia by the Assyrians. A second question about these shipments that is difficult to answer is their purpose and destination. There is evidence that the Assyrians attempted to administer directly this area through the establishment of garrisons, and thus it is reasonable to assume that these shipments were meant to support Assyrian troops that they were used to barter for goods to do so. Although it is possible that these shipments were bound for Assyria, upstream transport, especially of high bulk products like barley and other staples, must be ruled out. Furthermore, Lattimore has shown that long-distance transport by land of high bulk products is equally impractical. It is therefore likely that these shipments were bound for Assyrian storehouses within Babylonia. This reconstruction is supported by the fact that in one of his letters mentioning a barley shipment on the obverse, Ashipa reports on the reverse that a number of troops under his charge have been killed in an attack while apparently guarding a separate shipment of leather. Interestingly, Ashipa concludes the letter by assuring the king that the boats and their cargo are safe. These data suggest that the soldiers killed were in fact part of an Assyrian cohort meant to guard the transshipment of goods overseen by Ashipa. Another interesting aspect of these letters highlighted in the above passage is Ashipa's use of and concern for boats. Babylonia was, of course, not only traversed by the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but was also dissected by an intricate system of canals. Okay, I'm on a canal slide, right? Good. Although the original purpose of these artificial watercourses was probably irrigation, their use as transportation routes was likely equally important. Given this, it is worth discussing Ashipa's reference to watercraft in Babylonia. Daniel Potts has argued that Mesopotamian watercraft can be broken down into two categories based on the material of construction. He suggests that seafaring vessels were made of wood, while boats used for canal travel and transport were constructed of reeds. This is particularly interesting given the large corpus of glyptic, mostly from earlier periods, depicting flat boats with high upturned prows and sterns. The evidence suggests that these are, in fact, depictions of reed boats. It is, of course, impossible to say with certainty whether or not the boats mentioned in Ashipa's letters were constructed of reeds, or more broadly, if the Assyrians utilized this technology for transportation within Babylonia. But several lines of reasoning support such a hypothesis. First, although reed boats sit relatively low in the water, they are very buoyant and can thus carry relatively heavy loads. Second, reed boats have no keel, and are thus well suited for travel in shallow water. In this context, it is worth noting that worth quoting Nimrud Letter 36, wherein, in reporting on an expected barley shipment, Ashipa uses the verb shadadu, to tow or drag, in reference to his boats, saying, "I dragged up the boats to get the barley." This suggests that large or heavy boats were dragged by animals or people using ropes from the banks of the canals. And it also might show that reed boats were likely cheaper to construct than wooden boats, since reeds were available in many parts of southern and northern Babylonia, whereas wood was relatively rare. I have argued elsewhere that imperial policy was, to use the Inca scholar Terence Daltroy's term, flexible, in that members of the Assyrian court took many factors into consideration in their implementation of Assyrian imperialism. One question that Ashipa's Nimrud letters raise is whether or not mid-ranking officials were given similar flexibility. For example, one could envision a situation in which an official like Ashipa was given the task of procuring grain levies from village managers or local representatives and transporting them to garrisons or imperial storehouses. To do so, he was given the support of a cohort of troops, but he was otherwise left largely on his own to arrange and coordinate the work. In such a situation, Assyrian officials may have relied on local customs, technologies, and perhaps even manpower to carry out their work. This might include, for example, contracting, constructing, or commandeering, in this case reed boats, and using them to transport levies under guard along established routes. The second group of texts attributed to Ashipa is certainly of slightly later date than those just discussed. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, where was I? The second group of texts attributed to Ashipa is certainly later than those just discussed. If the reconstruction presented above is correct, then Ashipa was placed in charge of the province of Tushan at the beginning of or early in the reign of Sargon. Depending on the chronology of the Nimrud letters, there are two possible reconstructions of how Ashipa came to be governor of this important province. First, the Nimrud letters attributed to Ashipa, if the Nimrud letters attributed to Ashipa were produced during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, then Ashipa served as a mid-ranking official in Babylonia at the end of the reign of that king. Since the transition from Tiglath-Pileser III to Sargon was anything but a smooth transfer of power, it is quite likely that many of the highest administrators in Tiglath-Pileser's administration were purged, either during Shalmaneser V's short reign or when Sargon took power. Since Sargon would have been in need of officials to fill newly vacated positions, it is possible that Sargon could have promoted a successful mid-rank official like Ashipa to the rank of governor. When Ashipa became a governor, the province of Tushan had already been an important part of the Assyrian Empire for over 150 years. This province, which was originally annexed early in the reign of Ashurnazirpal, was of vital strategic importance to the Assyrians. Not only was the valley formed by the upper Tigris River an important supply zone, but this province served as a bulkhead against the kingdom of Urartu. The concerns of a governor focused both on the economic exploitation and of an important province and the geopolitical situation of a frontier area come through clearly in Ashipa's correspondence. I have already noted that a number of Ashipa's letters make reference to 4 activities that can be grouped under the term economic matters. These activities are logging, cutting stone, the acquisition of fruit tree saplings, and the production of wool. While these references may seem mundane, they give us an interesting insight into how imperial policy affected the economics of an outlying province. Archaeologist and scholar of South Asia, Carla Sanopoli, has noted the importance of large-scale construction projects in the creation and maintenance of imperial ideologies. She suggests that the construction of new capitals or the significant modification of existing ones, may be both a political and an ideological act meant to differentiate a ruler from his predecessors by reorienting the symbolic center of the empire. While her discussion of imperial capitals certainly holds true for the Assyrian Empire, a focus on microhistory allows us to consider not just the ideological impact of such projects, but how large and small construction projects affected the provincial administration. During the reign of Sargon, much of the resources of the empire were being expended on the construction of Sargon's new capital at Dur-Sharrukain. Sargon's correspondence shows that Assyrian governors were assigned specific tasks and ordered to supply specific materials for the construction. It is in this context that we must consider Ashipa's references to saplings and hewn stone. In both cases, Ashipa is likely responding to orders for these materials similar to those known to have been sent to other governors, like this one here. It is also clear that much of the timber needed, not only for the construction of Dur-Sharrukain, but also for many other construction projects, came from the Upper Tigris River region in what is today southeastern Turkey. Although only 2 of Ashipa's letters concern logging, there are quite a number of letters from other governors that, when combined with those belonging to Ashipa, shed considerable light on this activity. Assyrian exploitation of timber from this region took place on a very large scale. One of the surviving references to logging from Ashipa's correspondence, for example, mentions 3,000 door beams, while the references from Shah Ashur-Dubu, remember another governor of Tushan, and Nasher-Bel, remember governor of Amedi, list numbers such as 1,200, 2,000, 2,000 roof beams, 1,200 roof beams, 500 roof beams, 1,000 door beams, etc. These and other letters about logging show that provincial governors organized logging expeditions in the mountains north of the Upper Tigris. To do so, crews were sent under guard to predetermined location to fell the trees and prepare them for shipment. Later, crews of men were sent to haul the logs to the riverbank. The logs were generally, I know that phone ringing is not me because I turned off my phone. The logs were eventually floated down the river to a specific gathering point along the Tigris. Since many of the logs extracted by the governors of Tushan were almost certainly floated down the Batman River from the highlands of Shubria and beyond, Tushan's log drive stationing point was likely at or near the Tigris-Batman confluence. Once a sufficient number of logs were gathered and Assyrian officials judged there to be enough water in the rivers, Assyrian signal stations, forts, and settlements along the river and in the downstream provinces were alerted, and the logs were floated down the river in massive log drives. Needless to say, log drives on the magnitude of the numbers mentioned above were a big undertaking that involved large numbers of personnel and considerable coordination. Logging in the Upper Tigris was complicated by the fact that considerable deforestation had already taken place in the Upper Tigris region by the end of the 8th century BC, and for this reason, Assyrian logging crews were forced to venture far into the mountains north of Amedi and Tushan to find suitable timber. Although much of the timber mentioned in these texts was likely bound for Sargon's new capital, Dur-Sharrukain, Dur-Sharrukain was not the only major construction project to take place during the course of Neo-Assyrian history. Similar circumstances would have prevailed not only during the construction of other imperial capitals, but during the course of smaller construction projects, both in and around the province of Tushan and in the Assyrian heartland. A single reference to red wool may also be illustrative of larger economic processes taking place in the Upper Tigris. Contrasting the faunal assemblages from sites in the Upper Tigris, I have argued elsewhere that in an effort to increase revenues and control access to raw materials, Assyrian provincial administrators may have monopolized certain segments of the provincial economies. The faunal data augment this reference and support the theory that Ashipa and presumably other governors of Tushan held tight control over the herding industry. The fact that the above-mentioned text specifies red wool lends support to the theory that the provincial authorities also managed facilities to process many of the raw materials produced under their direction. A number of scholars have studied the rivalry between Assyria and Urartu. The perspective obtained through microhistorical analysis adds depth to this understanding since it focuses our attention on how this rivalry played out on the local level. In this regard, a small group of Ashipa's Sargon correspondence addresses matters of imperial security. These texts demonstrate that the conflict between Assyria and Urartu was manifest in the daily administration of the provinces of Tushan and Amedi in a number of ways. First, one of the main preoccupations of officials in these regions was spying on Urartu. There are two texts concerning the, quote, news of the Urartians in the correspondence of Ashipa, and one text mentions the exploits of Urartian governors. These and other texts concerning espionage suggest that the Assyrian provincial authorities attempted to infiltrate towns and villages beyond the frontier with Assyrian spies and either bought or co-opted or extorted information from residents and political leaders there. There are a number of references in the Neo-Assyrian corpus to the Shubrian leader's role in espionage. One such letter belonging to the correspondence of Ashipa is not entirely clear about the Shubrian leader's loyalties. One possibility is that this letter reports that the Shubrian leader was spying not on the Urartians, but for the Urartians. Whether or not this is the case, this possibility highlights the fact that espionage was being initiated from both sides of the frontier. Not only did governors like Ashipa have to organize and manage their own information gathering, they also had to counter Urartian efforts to infiltrate and even destabilize Assyria's holdings in their region. One of the texts in Ashipa's correspondence shows that the threat of conflict between Assyria and Urartu was real and constant. Although parts of the preceding analysis are admittedly speculative, my hope is that this paper serves to illustrate an important point. After nearly a century of research, a huge amount of textual data, not to mention many studies and analysis, are widely available. This has set the stage for the productive integration of ideas, methodologies, and data from a number of regions, subdisciplines, and disciplines. I hope that by viewing a specific official from the perspective of microhistory, I have foreshadowed the fruits that the future of Mesopotamian studies might hold. This analysis might lead us to consider social or bureaucratic mobility among Assyrian officials, for example. Could effective Assyrian officials work their way up in Assyria's bureaucratic ladder, or were positions in the Assyrian administration only allocated to individuals based on their social position and the influence of their families? And you notice there that I'm quoting Kirk Grayson, who said that. Okay, the reference to the reverse assimilation of the Assyrian Empire is another issue that might be addressed through this kind of study. If the name Ashipa could be shown to be non-Assyrian, and I'm certain that it is non-Assyrian, what does this say about Assyrian ethnicity? Might this official's career document the same process through which the Assyrian Empire became so-called Aramaeanized? So I'm referring to an argument here, especially by Haim Tadmor, who has written on the Aramaeanization of the Assyrian Empire, the diluting of the Assyrian ethnicity. And finally, let's see here. And finally, such a study certainly shows us more, or allows us more insight into the mechanics of Assyrian provincial administration. Even though the king sent regular correspondence to his provincial officials, information flow was such that letters were usually written or reached their destination well after the fact. Clearly, this left the day-to-day decision-making in the hands of provincial officials. In a province like Tushan, where autonomous states such as Urartu and Shubria were a constant threat. Espionage was part of daily life, and the extraction of natural resources such as timber and stone were essential to the continued legitimacy of the Assyrian king. One misstep could lead to disaster. In the pre-modern world, the functioning of large state or empire-level bureaucratic apparatus, in the pre-modern world, the functioning of a large state or empire-level bureaucratic apparatus must have relied heavily on officials who, although perhaps guided by royal directives, made daily decisions in relative isolation of the imperial capital. Thank you.